Thank you, Watcom Reeds, for this opportunity to be here. It's wonderful to be part of my community here in Bellingham and Whatcom County in a way that makes a difference. I've lived here for 30 years, and I can't think of a better place to be with the kinds of people who I know are so committed to making a difference in our community, in our nation, and in the world as well too. I've really enjoyed the time I've been here, and although I grew up in New York, I really consider myself a Washingtonian. Having said that, I also want to say how much I've appreciated the last 2.5 years of working with Humanities Washington to deliver this presentation around the state. Now, unfortunately, the pandemic actually extended our time. I mean, it's both a good news and a bad news situation in that it allowed me an additional 6 to 9 months to work with this specific presentation in Humanities Washington, although I wish that were not the case. And so in some respects, the opportunity to be here to present this program, Let's Talk About Race, comes towards the end of my tenure for this program with Humanities Washington. And I look forward to working with them again in the upcoming season. And perhaps I'll also be available to present in some other capacity with them as well. Humanities Washington is a great program. It's one of the programs that we all should be proud of. Like Whatcom Reeds, Humanities Washington brings presenters like me and others all around the state, to all corners of the state, to prisons I've visited, to small libraries in rural parts of the state. Not only is it an opportunity to present, but it's an opportunity to listen and to learn about the state that we live in and the people who populate different portions of this state. So I really want to thank Humanities Washington for making these kinds of presentations possible. And I hope you go to humanitieswashington.org, humanities.org, in order to see what else they may have that would be of interest to you, since right now, I think just about 100% of the presentations are online, and that makes it a lot easier for many people to actually attend. Hey, I'm going to take a minute here and just pull up my presentation. And in a moment, you should see on your screen a presentation entitled Let's Talk About Race. And let's see, I am going to ask, I see a friend of mine, Leslie Compton on. Leslie, would you give me a thumbs up if you can see that on your screen? Thank you. That lets me know that just about everybody else can probably see me as well too. Again, I want to thank you, Leslie, for that help. So as I said, I've delivered this presentation probably 50 or 60 times around the state. And it's really been an opportunity to share and to listen where people are at in having a really important discussion about a topic that is not going away until we really, as a community and as a nation, engage with this discussion about a really important topic. So what I'd like to do this evening is several things. First, I would like to just, give you a little introduction to this topic. I'd like to talk about why should we have a conversation about race, and also talk about why, particularly as a country, do we seem to want to avoid this kind of a conversation. Most importantly, I want to share with you some thoughts and ideas about tools for having this conversation. And then, really critical part of this is the opportunity to use some of these tools on one-on-one sessions. We're going to turn this over to breakout sessions where you can actually test out, try out some of the tools I'm suggesting that might be important in helping you have these kinds of conversations. Afterwards, we will have a question and answer period. And I should also say that this presentation is being recorded. So in case you want to refer to it, you can. I will also make this PowerPoint available to Katie, and you can get in touch with her or the Bellingham Public Library, I'm sure, in order to get a copy of this PowerPoint presentation, should you be interested in. Just a short disclaimer, I want to make sure that you know this is an educational presentation only, and it's expressing my views, and my views may not necessarily be the views, beliefs, or policies of Whatcom County, the city of Bellingham, or the Whatcom County Library System, and I should add to that Whatcom Reads as well too. So everything you hear being said, I take responsibility for. And I'm also going to assume that as adults, you are here because you want to be here, and that you're going to stay with us because you feel the presentation might offer you something of value. If at any point, at any time, for whatever reason, you feel that this presentation is not what you need at this point, I'm not going to be upset, and I'm sure nobody who's organizing this event is going to be upset if you walk away from your screen and leave the meeting. Again, we're here because we want to be here, not because anybody's forcing us here. So where does this start? And maybe let's start with, why have a conversation about race? Now, I've asked this question all over the state, hundreds of people, and I've heard lots of different responses. But these are some of the responses that most of the time surface somewhere at the top of this list. So one of the things I've heard a number of times is, and I certainly don't disagree, the reason to have a conversation about race is it's an unresolved issue that won't disappear by itself. And another thing that I also have heard, if we don't talk about race, we'll only fight about it. We only need to look to places like Charlottesville, or what happened 2 weeks ago at our nation's capital, to see how the truth of that statement. It's the only way to bridge our differences. And I certainly would have to agree with that. I don't know how else two people bring about some level of understanding when they don't agree on everything than having a conversation. One of the things that you'll hear me say a number of times throughout this presentation is that I have a background as a psychotherapist. I did 3 years postdoctoral training in psychotherapy, and I know what it's like to sit across from people, from families, in which pretty much no one agrees 100% with each other. Any of you who've been in a relationship also know what that's like. And you know that the only way, unless you want to fight with your partner, your family, your friends, of bridging the differences you might have is by finding some way to talk about those differences. Unfortunately, in our country, we often don't have in our educational system, we don't often deliver to students the tools that would help them have conversations like this. Now, if I was with you in person, I might ask you, what are your thoughts, and hear you tell me what those thoughts are. I'm not going to do that over this Zoom call because it's a little bit cumbersome, but I will ask you to take a moment, reflect to yourself. What are your thoughts about why to have a conversation about race? And as I'll let you ponder that question for a moment, you might even call to mind some of the recent events that have taken place in this country. Why have a conversation about race? Perhaps it's for some of the reasons that I've listed above, or perhaps there are other reasons as well. Some of the other reasons I've heard, for example, are, well, it's a way of learning about people's experience that I may never have an opportunity to learn about in another way. Hand in hand with why having a conversation about race is why avoid that same conversation. And again, having asked this question around the state to hundreds and hundreds of people, these are some of the responses that have popped up most frequently. And one I hear a lot is, I'm afraid to reveal my true feelings. If I have a conversation about race, people won't understand me, so I'd rather avoid that conversation. If I avoid a conversation about race, people won't call me, or let me put it another way, if I have a conversation about race, people will call me a blank, you fill in the blank. And therefore, I'd rather avoid it because I don't want to be called, again, you put whatever name you want there, a bigot, a racist, prejudice, you name it. And once again, if I were with you, I would ask you to think about what your feelings are about why avoid a conversation like this, and to share those thoughts and feelings with us. I'm going to ask you to do that in the silence and private of your own home, of your own room, wherever you're viewing this presentation from. Just take a moment and reflect on this question: why avoid a conversation about race? And as you're thinking about this question, why avoid a conversation about race, let me just tell you a story that I had. About 20 years ago, I was teaching in outside of Freiburg, Germany, at a place called the Institute for Angewandten Kinesiology, the Institute for Applied Kinesiology. Now, I had taught somatic psychology in a lot of places around the world, and I pretty much knew what my teaching schedule was, how much time to devote for each topic. But it seemed like in Germany, my schedule was thrown off because every time I gave the students in that class an exercise that involved them interacting with each other, what I thought would be 5 or 10 minutes invariably went to 15, 20, or even 30 minutes. And so at a point in time, first I was getting a little frustrated. And then I said, well, maybe I should find out why this is. And so I asked them, why is it that if I assign a very short exercise, seems like if people are talking about that, and I often put two people together to talk about that, it takes double, even triple or more the amount of time. And this is what I heard. We talk about everything until we have nothing more to say. We talk because our parents' generation didn't talk during the Third Reich, during the Holocaust, when they should have. Wow, when I heard that, I really let go of needing to have my schedule as part of the class, and I was fine to adapt and adopt whatever schedule that these folks had, because I felt that was as important as anything else I could teach. And I also thought at that moment, wouldn't that be great if we here in America had that same sense of, we're going to talk out all the issues that we have until we have nothing more to say. We don't have that history. And again, we don't have those tools that we share with our students and young people who grow up in that environment. Boy, I was amazed at what some Germans had in that regard, and really impressed by that as well too. So here's the really cool thing in having difficult conversations. There's not a lot of rules. The rules aren't really that challenging. The challenging part comes in actually implementing them. If you think about what we learn about having conversations, what we really learn in school is about having debates. You have one set of ideas, another person has another set of ideas, and you go back and forth in a sense of hoping that one person, or believing that one person's ideas can win out over the other person's. Just turn on a cable news network, watch any program where you have, we even call them talking heads, and you'll see a really good, end product of an educational system which does nothing to teach people about having challenging conversations, and everything to teach people about simply how to debate. 3 things, 3 tools go into having a challenging conversation, like a conversation about race. Basic definitions, active listening, and how to engage from your heart and not your head. Again, really simple to say, a little more challenging to do, but that's why we're going to end this time together with an opportunity for you actually to put some of these ideas in practice and see what benefit or not they bring. So let's start with basic definitions. This, I think, is really important. And it's amazing to me how many people don't understand that race is not scientific. There is no scientific basis for race. Race is a social construct. That means race is a created idea that has been used for various social reasons, whether they're political, economic, educational, labor, you name it. Race is a social construct. Here's what I mean. Africans who were once considered the darkest skinned people in the world until native Pacific Islanders were found with skins just as dark as Africans. Oops, all of a sudden, race doesn't hold up. Europeans were once considered to have the straightest hair and thinnest noses until those same native Pacific Islanders were found to have just as straight hair and just as thin noses. Oops, once again, any concept you might have of race, it doesn't hold up with the very facts of our human family. Blood protein matching shows Northern Europeans are physiologically closer to Africans than to Asians or Pacific Islanders. And the same DNA, by the same token, DNA matching shows Northern Europeans are evolutionarily closer to Australian Aborigines than to Africans. Wow, really interesting here. And again, I think important in terms of a basic definition about race is that race doesn't exist other than as a social construct, something we create for other reasons. DNA fingerprinting, and this is something that many people know, but I think always doesn't get into this conversation about race, is that DNA fingerprinting shows that all humans come from a common African ancestor some 150 to 200,000 years ago. And really the division of the human family into population groups of similar skin color, texture, and the other body characteristics that we often feel can define race, even though they don't, only happened about 90 to 100,000 years ago. So a very short period of time in our human family. I always like what some scientists have said as early as the middle of the last century. Franz Boas, for example, reminding us that we talk about race all the time, but nobody can really ever give a definition of what constitutes a race, and that's because there is no scientific basis for it. That the existence of human subspecies is purely hypothetical, and that nowhere in our human family does there exist a subspecies as we might find it in animals. Again, kind of a scientific way of describing races, but still, it's a definition that we often think of. We divide our human family into subspecies based on race. Those subspecies are based on various physical characteristics. As we showed in the last slide, those characteristics just don't hold up. I like this definition a lot, or at least this observation, I should say, because it's really speaking to the issue of our use of words here. In this case, the term race, and that it's a greatly debased word that really has no meaning in terms of how we describe the human family and human populations, and recognize that these are definitions, along with probably my favorite, Ashley Montagu's definitions. These happened in the last half of the last century, so they're 50 years old or older, and yet somehow what the science says we haven't really taken to heart, even though we often talk about following the science wherever it leads, certainly in terms of race and racism and those kinds of discussions. Most people have not followed the science and would rather follow their own, as Ashley Montagu said, Procrustean rack of predetermined categories. I love that word, and that simply means Procrustean almost means what it sounds. Procrustean has that idea of rigid and fixed and crusted, and that's exactly what it means. When you force facts into predetermined categories, regardless of whether those categories have any validity in truth or not. And we lived through 4 years of a kind of Procrustean rack of predetermined categories coming straight down from the highest office in this land. And when it comes to race, This is something that's been going on in this country and continues to go on in this country, again, because race is a social construct, not a scientific reality. So it's a great definition to start with. And to that, I would add, if you take nothing away from this presentation, the following slide, the slide you're looking at, is really, I think, probably the most important slide in my whole presentation. I didn't come up with this idea. The 1970 Kerner Commission, impaneled by Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was then president, came up with this idea. Some of you may remember that the Kerner Commission was impaneled in order to study why in the summers of 1968 and 69, urban centers were up in arms, up in flames often. The vision on television in those days, very much like what we see on the internet last summer with cities and protests. And the only difference I would say, and I think it's a good difference, is that over the summer, we probably saw more white folks hand in hand with Black folks protesting police brutality. Back in the 60s, 68 and 69, there were Black folks in New York and Detroit and Chicago and Los Angeles and Houston who were up in arms because of some of the same reasons that they were up in arms over the summer, showing you how little, in a sense, had changed. But what was important about the Kerner Commission, again, impaneled by Lyndon Baines Johnson, trying to really come up with some understanding of why this was taking place. So here's a commission. It's composed of just one African-American man, mostly white men from the South, which at first glance, I thought, oh my God, they're not really going to have much that really gets to this, to the heart of the issue. And yet, one of the most important things of that commission's report, and that report's still available on Amazon.com, is they came up with a really good definition of racism. Now, if you were driving with me in a car, you'd often hear me cursing, yelling, or screaming at the radio, because I don't care whether it's NPR or CNN or you name it. Often, those news media are throwing around terms without ever defining them, and the terms they throw around might make for good sound bites, but they do nothing to advance the kinds of discussions that we need. And so the Kerner Commission said, look, let's start with a good definition of racism. And what they said is that racism equals prejudice plus power. Anybody, they said, can be prejudiced. Prejudice simply means you have a view of a particular situation before, in the absence of all relevant facts, and sometimes even when those facts are presented to you, you still hold on to that previous view. Anybody can be prejudiced. I might like you because you're too tall, or you're too short, or you weigh too much, or you weigh too little, or your hair is blonde, or your hair is brunette, or your eyes are green, or your eyes are blue. Or your skin is dark, or your skin is light. There are all sorts of reasons that I might not like you. But the Kerner Commission said that just because I'm prejudiced, that doesn't rise to the definition of being racist. What they said is that racism is prejudice plus power. The power to implement that prejudice in some way that affects a person's life, educationally, politically, socially, physically, emotionally, you name it. That there has to be added to prejudice power. I think that's a great definition for a couple of reasons. First, it separates out prejudice and power, and therefore allows us to have a reasoned discussion about prejudice and power. You know, we've said a little bit about prejudice, but what about power? We can be talking about personal power, like what happens when two individuals meet, or what happens when someone doesn't like what a neighbor may have put on the side of their house and either erases it or maybe spray paints something on it. That's personal power. We can talk about institutional power, like the power that we confer to our police departments and how they use that power, or our educational institutions and what they teach and the kinds of environments they create for students from marginalized groups, perhaps students of color. So power can be discussed in lots of different ways, and I think that's really important. And prejudice can be discussed in lots of different ways as well, too. Look, we often talk about racist and anti-racist. and we talk about reverse racism. And I have to tell you, if you take this definition, it helps having this discussion because, anybody can be prejudiced, and therefore anybody can be reversely prejudiced. I don't like you, you don't like me. That's an instance of reverse prejudice. Not everybody can be reverse racist if you go on the Kerner Commission's definition, because racism is prejudice plus power. And most of the time, marginalized communities and individuals don't have the power, even if the prejudice is there. Again, a great definition. I think it's a really good place to start. Let me just add a little bit to this, because I've heard this in lots of the presentations that I've given, is that, wow, this is not only a great definition for racism, but you could substitute sexism, you could substitute ageism, you could substitute many of the socially divisive issues that we have for this and see that it's prejudice plus power. And it's important to have that discussion based on separating out those two as a way to engage around bridging differences, having some understanding, and maybe actually even implementing policy that might bring about change. So racism equals prejudice plus power. The other thing that I often hear people say, having presented this definition to them, is there's this kind of collective sigh of relief often in the audiences. I can't know if it's happening now because this is taking place over Zoom, but it's a collective sigh of relief that when I've asked, people have said, wow, maybe I'm not racist, maybe I'm prejudiced, but I might not be racist. And I think, again, that's a great place to start, because prejudice is something we also have to obviously contend with. But unpacking the emotions from a definition like this can also be a great place to start. So let's go on. Active listening, really easy to say, really easy to tell you the tools of active listening. Not always that easy to sort out, figure out, understand. How do you implement them? Now, I have to tell you that active listening is a skill that's developed. And like any skill, it just doesn't happen overnight. When I went to psychotherapy school, we worked on this skill, not for a couple of lessons, but for all 3 years that I was doing my postdoc work. Active listening is something you only learn as you do it. Easy to say, a little bit more challenging to do. And the reason it's more challenging to do is we as a culture are not trained in these skills. So what do I mean? The first one is the ability to listen without talking. The greatest example of this not happening, again, back on cable news. So one person says something and the other person actually doesn't even let that first person finish before they start talking. There's no way they could have been listening as the first individual was talking. Maybe great debating skills. Even in debating, we ask people to wait for one person to finish. But even in a debate, when you've got two people maybe standing at two different podiums, talking, arguing, presenting facts on a similar topic from different points of view, we train individuals to listen to the other person, not so much for what they're saying, but what I can say. Oh, that person said this, that means I can say that. Oh, they didn't say this. That's one of the points I've got. I can say that. Oh, they did say this. In order to counter that, I'm going to say that. That is not listening for the purpose of understanding. That's listening to try to win a point. So the ability to listen to another person without talking over that person, giving them the space to say whatever they need to say, however they need to say it, however long it takes. That's what the first part of active listening is all about. The second part of active listening is the ability to repeat what another person has said without editing it so much that it has no meaning. So let me give you a good example. One person in a discussion says, when I walked into that group of all white folks, I was really scared. And then the other person says, Oh, there probably wasn't any need to be scared because I'm sure they weren't going to do anything to you. Now, that might at some level seem like a really nice conversation to have, but if you just go a little deeper, what the second person has done has really invalidated what the first person's experience was by starting out saying, there was no need for you to have the feelings that you had. Now, let's try that conversation in a little bit different way. First person says, God, I was really scared when I walked into that group of all white folks, say at a Grange meeting. And the second person might say, boy, I hear that you had some fear. I wonder if that's something we can talk about. So what's happened this second interaction is the person is acknowledging what that person said, maybe even saying back to them what they heard, maybe not using exactly the right words like a parrot might do, but at least conveying to them that they got the message. And if you don't understand what a person is saying, you know, the easiest thing to do is ask them, hey, I didn't really get what it was you were saying. Could you say that again? Or maybe help me by saying it a different way. So the ability to be able to have kind of a clear channel of communication by repeating without editing to the point that you're changing what that person is saying, maybe using slightly different words, but not changing the meaning. That's a second really important aspect of active listening. Then a third important point of active listening is really how do you hold space for another person to say what it is they need to say without necessarily judging them. So I'm just saying here, respect without judging, but another way of saying that is holding space. What do I mean by that? It simply means this. Just because a person is speaking, it doesn't mean you have to agree with them. I hear this a lot, and I'm really surprised by it. I think I understand a little bit where it comes from. Particularly hear from young people. Well, if I allow this person to speak, it means that I agree with them. I don't know where that comes from in a sense. I think it comes from, in part, this idea that we live or should live only with people who profess similar beliefs to us in our educational institutions. I think one of the great challenges is, is it really a safe space when you create an echo chamber for students that never exposes them to divergent views? Now, my sense, it's probably not. That one of the things we need to understand as individuals who engage with each other and our differences is it's okay to listen to what somebody says, even if you vehemently disagree with them. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything wrong with you. You don't have to agree with somebody in order to listen to them. And I think underneath that skill of being able to listen to somebody without necessarily feeling you have to believe them, is somewhat of a sense of how do you listen in a way that's engaged, but not necessarily deeply attached. How do I listen to somebody and really get what they're saying without feeling I'm somehow attached to the emotions and the sentiments that they have? And that's a skill, again, practice in a sense makes perfect here, or at least helps us get better at being able to respect what a person has to say without judging that that's going to change myself in any way. I can listen to you even if I don't agree with you. So those three skills, that's an important part of having this conversation about race. Another thing that's really important for me, I don't know if you heard this in the introduction about, I'll just say this, not only did I do 3 years of postdoc training in psychotherapy, but I did 4 years of doctoral training as a chiropractor. So bodies have a really important meaning in how I know people communicate nonverbally. And there's a wonderful acronym that we use to help people engage in communication with each other. It's called SOLER, SOLER, not like the sun, but it's close enough so that we can remember that. And even though we're going to be communicating over Zoom, over the internet, some of these body-based skills really still hold. So S in solar stands for square. In other words, squarely facing somebody when you're involved with them. Even if you're looking at a person in a video screen, you're not doing this as you're talking, because that suggests you're not really engaged with them. The O stands for open. Keeping an open posture. So you're not having a conversation with somebody like this. That body posture says already, I'm really close to what it is you have to say, and you can say whatever you want. There's a certain way that I'm not going to hear that. So having an open posture. Another thing, you can watch how you're leaning forward or back from that person. If the person is talking and you start to do this, you've already said with your body, whatever you're saying is repulsing me because I'm leaning back. One of the things that's really easy to do with Zoom even is to have good eye contact. Again, you're looking at the person you're speaking to. You're not having a conversation like this where you're looking away. And that's what the E stands for eye contact. The R, it's really great to have and to try to have somewhat of a relaxed body as you're having even these difficult conversations, and at least not having the kind of fidgety situation where maybe, your fingers are tapping on your knee and your leg is bouncing up and down, and it's pretty obvious that you're not comfortable in your body as this person is talking to you. So when we actually get to engaging with each other, I want you to take a moment in that discussion and tune in to your body, particularly as you're listening, and ask yourself, hey, what's going on in my body as we're having this conversation? And if there's some way you can change what's going on in your body, I invite you to figure out how to do that. I love these two quotes, one by Andrew Bennett, the other by Lao Tzu. Andrew Bennett's quote, the longest journey you'll ever take is the 18 inches from your head to your heart. And Lao Tzu's quote, the first step on the path to wisdom is the ability to say, I don't know. And again, what they're suggesting, both quotes, is that we need to get out of our heads, particularly when we're having or trying to have these really important, difficult conversations. Again, we train people to debate, and we call the people on TV talking heads. We don't call them talking hearts. Boy, that would be really interesting to actually have people who were talking hearts on a television program. I'd love to see that. The challenge, the problem is that I think we really need to understand how to listen by asking the question, how does this make me feel? Rather than what does this make me think? And I've often said to people who say, well, I don't even know how this makes me feel. I've often suggested to them that they tune into their body. So as you're listening to one person speak, what's going on in your body? Are you feeling relaxed? Are you feeling tight? Are your muscles twitching? Is your lip quivering? You can, if you can't tune into your feelings, I bet you can tune into something taking place in your body. So you listen by asking yourself, how does this make me feel? Rather than what does this make me think? When this person across from me is talking, what's my experience in terms of how I feel, as opposed to what am I thinking about? And when you speak, you can offer to this conversation, this is how I feel, rather than this is what I think. So often it is that we engage in conversation from the point of view of our head, meaning, this is what I think when you're saying this, and this is what I think, and we try to go back and forth. And I've said this a couple of times. I don't think that's ever going to get us anywhere. Change doesn't happen because, or most of the time doesn't happen because you intellectually convince someone that their views on the world, on life, on race are wrong. Change happens when two people can bridge their differences based on, we often say stepping into the shoes of another person. Well, that stepping into the shoes happens more readily by the feeling sense we get from another individual than by the intellectual capacity we have to debate another person's views or beliefs. Hey, I said a lot. So let's actually set ourselves up to try to use some of what it is I've shared with you in conversation with each other. I think we can probably take, even half an hour here to break ourselves up into breakout sessions with two people in each room. And on your screen, you're probably gonna get a little pop-up that says, the breakout is happening, and something where you'll have to click to allow yourself into that breakout session. One person's going to speak first, then the other person will speak afterwards. And when that person speaks, we're going to ask you to actually really speak, trying to use those tools for having a conversation about race. And I'm going to ask you to have a conversation that's based on the following question. What is it like to realize that demonstrations and discussions about racial equity are now taking place across the country and around the world? Again, one person speaks, the other person listens. The person who's speaking tries to, best as they can, speak from their heart. The person who's listening tries to use some of those tools like active listening, like listening from your heart as well too, some of the things we talked about. And then at a point in the middle of that, 15 minutes for each person, I'll tell you to switch, and you can switch who's the speaker and who's the listener. So I'm going to ask Katie if she would start that process. I'm not going to be in a breakout room because I want to monitor some of the things that are going on. You might even see me step away from the podium, but I hope you won't even notice that because you'll be too engaged with whomever it is you're engaging with in this discussion, which focuses on the question, what's it like to realize that demonstrations and discussions about racial equity are now taking place across the country and around the world? Having that discussion based on the tools that we've discussed. So we're going to get to back together as a group, and I can see people starting to come in. Thank you. And Katie, this is the part where, again, we'll maybe need your help because whomever would like to ask a question, more importantly, I'd like to hear what that experience was like. Please feel free to raise your hand, and Katie will allow you to unmute yourself, and you'll appear on the screen, and everyone should be able to hear you. I want to thank all of you for your bravery and your interest in actually trying to engage in that conversation. And I think we'd all like to hear, not just me, what that was like for you.
My name is Jane Rosenfeld. I live in Bellingham.
Hi, Jane.
Hi. I read your book, Clyde. It was really interesting, the Think Black book. I found that interesting. Anyway, I was talking with Julie Pham. We had an interesting conversation, and we both come from slightly different places, but she mentioned a word that I found like a key word, and that was curiosity about what somebody else is thinking, and that as a non-threatening kind of way to approach conversation with a heart of curiosity.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. It sounds like that's a meaningful key that you brought from that discussion that brings to mine a way of engaging in a difficult conversation that's non-threatening.
Yeah,
Did I get that right?
you did.
Thank you. Katie, do we have anyone else?
Yeah, we've got Mary Lou, and I'm going to go ahead and ask her to unmute and speak to us.
Hi, Katie, Clyde, everybody.
Hey, nice to see you on Zoom.
Thank you. I've been, what's his name, Kenji, reading How to Be a Non-Racist. And one of the things that I've picked up is that being racist or being anti-racist is not a static being, but it's in the decisions and choices we make. And he really emphasized how it's not just white people who can be racist, that he could be racist, and talking about that. And that was like, oh, and I think the curiosity that she just mentioned is a key word. And also just, what do you have to say about that in particular? You recommended that book to me, by the way, and I'm reading it.
And I think it's a great book. And I think the only difference I'd have with Ibram, who I've been on panels with, is I don't believe that anybody can be racist. I do believe anybody can be prejudiced. And I think that definition from the Kerner Commission is something that needs to be added to the mix of a discussion about that, because that really then makes that term that, and I know where Ibram's trying to go with that idea. I think, again, anybody can be prejudiced, but not everybody can be racist. That's an important distinction to make.
I like that. Thank you, Clyde. Thank you.
I want to make sure that I leave you with this idea, and that is, just because you have a hammer doesn't mean that everything you see is a nail. And I say that as a metaphor to say that, the kind of tools that we shared in this brief time we spent together doesn't mean that everybody wants to have a discussion with you. And it also doesn't mean that you should want to have a discussion with anybody you meet simply because you have these tools. I imagine that you probably would not be able to go up to that fellow who described himself as a QAnon shaman. And I tell you, that is a real, how should I say it, that he had no clue of what he even meant when he was saying that, because he was by no means a shaman in anyone's definition. But he still described himself that way. The guy with the horns on. I don't think you want to go up to somebody like that with the skins on and say, I just went to this workshop with this guy, or this presentation, this guy named Clyde Ford. And he said there were all these tools that we could use to have a discussion about race. And I want to use these tools to talk with you. What I'm suggesting there is that the tools for having a conversation about race are just one set of skills. If we're going to talk about what's needed in terms of bringing about racial equity and about correcting some of the racial disparity that exists in so many places in this country. But they're only one set of tools. And there are other times when different sets of tools, different skills and different means and tactics are appropriate as well too. There's a time to protest. There's a time to legislate. There's a time to gain intellectual understanding of history and other things. And then there's also a time to converse or have a discussion. And I think you want to just make sure that whenever you attempt to have a discussion, you're doing it in a way that the first thing in your mind is your own safety. You don't want to try to have a discussion with somebody when you're also concerned about whether this is a safe thing to do. And as I said, I'm sure you can well imagine situations where attempting to have this kind of discussion isn't the right thing to do. So I just want to leave you with those thoughts and ideas, but also, again, thank you for your courage and the opportunities that you took to have this kind of discussion with a friend or neighbor or even somebody in your family. I think the more we learn how to have these conversations, the more better our community is going to be, our county is going to be, our state and our nation as well too. So once again, thank you. And I look forward to seeing you in the community. And I look forward to being part of the efforts that our community makes in these wonderful ways to bring about the kind of change and the kind of world we would like.
Clyde, I had two people who raised your hand while that you were talking. Do you want to hear
Oh,
from them?
absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to go ahead and call Dan Ohms and then Deborah.
I guess you can hear me. Thanks.
I can, Dan. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, no, my question was, the reason I lowered my hand was because you were talking about my question, and in that, how does one have a conversation? I've wanted to have conversations with people of color that I know, and I don't know how to have that conversation without kind of seeming like, oh, it's because I'm white. I can come up and say, well, what's going on? How are you feeling? How is this affecting you? What was your life like? Or what's happening? I feel like with other people, I can have that conversation, but I don't know how to do it without just kind of seeming like I'm just kind of weird.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks, Dan. I hear that one of the things that you are wondering about is how do you have a conversation, perhaps with a person of color, about these issues when it makes you feel weird to even open up the opportunity for that conversation. And I think this is something that Ibram Kendi probably would say, and that is, one of the greatest needs we have in this country right now is not necessarily to have this conversation across racial lines, but within families, with children, with relatives who may only be able to listen to you. And if you have this sense that there is something that needs to be said and needs to be discussed, those might be the folks and the place where you first want to start. So rather than reaching across lines, you might want to reach within, because I can't think of a more important task that folks can do than to have these kinds of challenging conversations with the people who they love and love them as a place to start.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.